My name is Cindy Borden, and I'm the Director of Training and Technical Assistance for the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans, where it is our mission to end veteran homelessness. Join us here each week as we use an equity lens to explore how specific demographic characteristics impact an individual's ability to access safe and affordable housing.
We want to take this time to acknowledge and thank the Home Depot Foundation for sponsoring this podcast and for continuing to fund veterans housing throughout the country. For roughly a decade, the Home Depot Foundation has remained committed to supporting the mission and work of NCHV. Their continued partnership means more housing availability for veterans and hopefully one day an end to veteran homelessness. The Home Depot Foundation works to improve the homes and lives of U.S. veterans, train skilled tradespeople to fill the labor gap, and support communities impacted by natural disasters. The Foundation's Veteran Housing Grants Program awards grants to nonprofit organizations for the new construction or rehabilitation of permanent supportive housing for veterans. Since 2011, the Foundation has invested more than $375 million in veteran causes and improved more than 50,000 veteran homes and facilities. The Foundation has pledged to invest $500 million in veteran causes by 2025 and $50 million in training the next generation of skilled tradespeople through the Path to Pro program. We'll be highlighting some of their work as we talk about various affordable housing developments throughout this series. If you're developing projects that support veterans exiting homelessness or would like to learn more about how the Home Depot Foundation is making a difference and continues to serve those who serve, visit homedepotfoundation.org.
Welcome back to the Road Home Podcast. As we continue to explore the impact of demographic characteristics on the ability to have safe, accessible, and affordable housing, today's episode will focus on gender identity and sexual orientation. Current estimates suggest that there are about 1 million LGBTQ+ veterans in the U.S., although many experts believe the real number is higher. While the data on this population is limited, we do know that transgender and non-binary veterans are more likely to experience unsheltered homelessness. While data is important, our conversation today will go deeper as we try to understand the experience of LGBTQ+ veterans. We'll start by hearing from Lindsay Church of Minority Veterans of America. We'll learn about the history of discrimination in the military based on sexual orientation and gender identity, including Don't Ask, Don't Tell and the trans ban. Lindsay will discuss the impact and trauma of serving while being marginalized and dehumanized, and share the experience of many LGBTQ+ veterans after service who find themselves torn between two communities, veteran and LGBTQ+, but not accepted by either. Then Lindsay will share their ideas about how to fix past and current inequities in the systems so LGBTQ+ veterans have access to safe and affordable housing. In the second half of the episode, we'll learn about a housing project that specifically targets older LGBTQ+ individuals, including veterans. Bryan Ellicott of Sage USA will talk about Stonewall House, the largest LGBTQ+ friendly elder housing development in the country. Stonewall House was developed through a partnership between the New York City Housing Authority, or NYCHA, BFC Partners, the New York City Housing Development Corporation, and Sage. We have a lot of information for you today, and I want to thank Lindsay and Bryan for the great conversation. Let's get started. So we're thrilled today to have Lindsay Church with us from Minority Veterans. Lindsay, can you introduce yourself and your organization?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for having me. My name is Lindsay Church. I am the Executive Director and co-founder of Minority Veterans of America. I am also a Navy veteran. I identify as trans non-binary. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a third generation Navy veteran myself. Most of my family served in the Navy. We had a few Air Force folks. We don't talk about them that much. But I come from a long line of service and founded the organization Minority Veterans of America in 2017. I'll get into that a little bit, but we are an intersectional movement of minority veterans coming together to create agency, voice, a community, and address equity gaps for the minority veteran community.
Great. So you said you formed Minority Veterans. So tell me a little bit about why that happened and how it happened.
Yeah, absolutely. So in 2017, we started MBA out of Seattle, Washington. I, at the time, was leading it was the post commander at American Legion Post. I had just founded a unit on the campus of the University of Washington for student veterans. It still stands. We served about 3,000 veterans a year. In all of that, I realized that the community wasn't built for us. Not that I didn't already know that in the military, but when it came to veterans, there was this belief that like veterans were a certain thing, that they were straight white Christian men, that most of the services were built for them, and that we weren't welcome in the community. This was happening across the identity spectrum and identity lines. My dear friend, Catherine Pratt, who is a Korean American woman veteran, one of the most brilliant human beings I've ever met, filled out her application for the University of Washington for a PhD and had to look up whether or not she was a veteran. Her dad was a veteran. He was a pilot. He's, was in combat, and he was a cis-het white man. And so like, she assumed that he was a veteran, but she still had to wonder whether she was. And so we came together under the idea that we would never understand what it feels like to live in each other's experience, or lived experiences. I'm queer, trans, non-binary, navigate the world a little bit differently. She's a woman of color, navigates the world a lot differently. And so between the two of us, we said, I will never understand what it feels like to live as you and your lived experiences, but what I do understand is marginalization. And I do understand oppression, and I have lived under policies and rules that have changed my life. And we know that there's only 1 million LGBTQ veterans. We'll get into that number in a minute, but there are 2 million women veterans, 1.6 million religious minority veterans, 5.5 million veterans who are racial and ethnic minorities. But if you break that down even further, and you find smaller and smaller and smaller groups. And the smaller that we are, the more they can say that we are a fringe on the fringe, that they don't need to serve us, that they don't need to do anything differently. And so we came together to create this intersectional movement of veterans across the identity spectrum to say, you can't ignore us. You can't pretend like our things don't exist. And when you look at the margins and you look at the intersections of identity, you'll find that a lot of our experiences are similar in some of the ways that bias and discrimination show up in the treatment of our communities. And so we started the organization as a coalition building movement. We've always said we're a movement, not an organization, because this organization is run by the people that are impacted by the issues and challenges that we face. And so we've been around for 5 years now. I call it a half a decade, not 5 years. We have about 3,000 members around the country and world. We do community building, but we also do a lot of policy work to try to address these equity gaps that exist for our community.
Awesome. So you've answered this a little bit in your description of the organization and what MVA is and how it formed, but who do you consider to be a minority veteran? As Minority Veterans of America, who are these minority veterans?
Yeah, that's a good question, and we get that a lot. And so for our purposes, we work with communities who are racial and ethnic minorities, gender, sexual orientation, and religious minorities. We know that these are 4 big factors and 4 places where we find a lot of oppression, rules, laws that have existed, othering, being treated as if they were outside. And so those 4 identities we brought together to say, this is our intersectional movement. These are the folks that we're going to serve. When you look at the numbers, like I mentioned, there's about 18 to 20, sometimes 22 million, but that number is dwindling. And so when you look at those numbers, 1 million out of even 18 million is not much. 2 million out of 18 million is very small. The more that you break these numbers apart, the more you see that these are the smallest communities that are in our smallest identities within our communities, yet the ones that have many laws that were built against them.
Yeah, so it's really interesting when you're talking about being marginalized and what that means when you're a small number of veterans is small compared to the main population. And so when you're a small subset of a small subset and what that can mean potentially. So for this episode, we're going to focus specifically on that LGBTQ plus community and veterans and the obstacles that they face. Some of our other episodes are looking at some of the other groups that you've talked about. We've talked a little bit in other episodes about history and the context of racism and the impact on what that means for housing and access to housing. I'm curious what you think the impact has been on these discriminatory policies and practices on LGBTQ veterans specifically.
Yes, there are many. So a little history lesson for those folks who may not know. There's two, when we're looking at LGBTQ veterans, we're looking at two things. We're looking at sexual orientation and gender identity. Both of these have been criminalized differently. The military for a long time held a policy throughout history of looking at sexual orientation first, right? That throughout history, you'll find different policies that existed that have rendered LGBT or LGB veterans or sexual minorities as criminals, have at least at one point deemed our community as mentally unfit or mentally unwell. They have turned us out because of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. For those who don't know what Don't Ask, Don't Tell was, it was a policy that was intended to help our community, but actually really cause a lot more harm than I think even good sometimes. So in 1991, 92, there was a policy called Don't Ask, Don't Tell that was released that meant that service members, it was considered the great compromise for for sexual minorities. And so they said that sexual minorities can serve and they can serve in our military, but they cannot do it openly. You cannot talk about who you are. You cannot tell anybody who you are. You cannot be seen as LGBTQ. We will let you be here so long as you don't act on those things. And so being human beings, that was not real. Like nobody can stop themselves. Like it's just, that policy was never going to work. But one of the things that I point to a lot is that a lot of people were discharged. They say that throughout history, I think about 100,000 LGBTQ veterans were removed under historic policies for being queer. And so throughout history, you see all these folks that were removed from the military had bad conduct discharges, other than honorable discharges, were criminalized for other types of behavior, but never could say that it was Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which is actually even more nefarious sometimes. Were kicked out on what's considered time in service, so that they could never get the benefits that they had earned because they never met the time and service requirements. So their GI Bill, they're not eligible for. Healthcare, they're sometimes not eligible for. They can't even meet that time in service. But one of the things that I think is interesting is that nobody in history that I can find was ever removed for asking. This policy was always meant to criminalize us, but never meant to hold other people accountable for witch hunts, sting operations. Like you see, I went to the Defense Language Institute as a linguist, and a couple of years before I was there were 13 linguists that were caught in a sting operation on LGBTQ, looking for LGBTQ people. And I was like, this feels wrong. Like you're not just like not asking us, and we're not just not telling you, you're asking us questions, you're searching us out. You're literally like honing in on communities that are already marginalized here, just trying to get through. So a lot of folks were removed under that policy. I think it was 13,000 have a technical discharge for Don't Ask, Don't Tell. There's been a concerted effort to try to upgrade these discharges. It's still really hard and people don't trust the system. So if you were kicked out in the military based off of your sexual orientation alone for like the person that you love, you hold another than honorable discharge and you go out into the world, why would you come back? Why would you go back to a system that is criminalized you, brutalized you, sent you to die, literally, like either in service in country or in another country? Like, why would you go back to that system? In addition, LGBT veterans are more likely to be sexually assaulted in the military, and then to be criminalized for being sexually assaulted and telling somebody. We've heard from veterans in the past that they were sexually assaulted, turned in their perpetrator, and they were kicked out, and their perpetrator still served. This is the system that was built to keep us out and to harm us. So going back to get that discharge upgraded isn't most people's priority. And throughout history, it has not been that easy. So that's just Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And that's not even talking about the mental, physical, emotional damage that was done by that policy and the fact that they literally broke us. Like throughout, the psychological warfare of Don't Ask, Don't Tell continues to have an outmeasured impact on our community and our livelihood, our well-being, our homelessness numbers. These are all linked to mental health crisis, to inability to transition and become a civilian, inability to find a job after the military. All of these things are a part of our story and a part of whether or not we can get access to these systems that are designed to serve us. So that's just sexual orientation. Then you look at gender identity, and we know, like throughout even just modern history, we know in 2017 that trans service members were supposed to be able to serve. There was a policy that was enacted that was supposed to allow trans service members to serve openly and authentically. And then there was the trans ban. So you see there's a bounce back. Like one, people don't realize that when Don't Ask, Don't Tell went away, trans people were never covered by that policy. Trans service was never like covered by Don't Ask, Don't Tell. The fight for Don't Ask, Don't Tell never covered trans people. That after Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed in 2012, people forgot about trans service members. Trans service members still had an outright ban that had never been removed. And so for another 5 years, trans people were serving and trying very hard to overturn the policy that was then Ash Carter released and said trans people can serve. And then Donald Trump said, absolutely not, by tweet. The psychological impacts of this alone, like, it's inhumane. 1 in 5 trans people will serve their country. That means that 20% of the trans community gets their healthcare benefits, their housing benefits, their education, their livelihood comes from the military. The military is the largest employer of trans people in the country, probably the world. And you mean to tell me that they can't serve because of a tweet? It's inhumane and it's unjust. So there's history has really made a dent on our community and really impacted whether or not we're able to be parts of this veteran community and are able to access the services that are supposed to be there to serve us after we wear the uniform.
So there's so much there, Lindsay. I don't even know where to start really unpacking it. But a couple of things that just stick out to me is 20% of trans people serve in the military. That's a much higher percentage than what we're talking about in the cisgender population, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a much higher percentage. And so there seems to be something there that's attracting trans people to come and want to serve. And yet once they're there, they're marginalized, they're dehumanized, and all of those things. And I just think about not just the tangible impacts that we'll talk about in a second when it comes to housing, and you mentioned benefits and those things, but the intangible things, the trauma, the psychological damage, when you're doing something to serve a country that is then turning it, not even just turning its back on you, sort of dehumanizing you.
Yeah. I have a series of posters that say serving my country when it doesn't serve me. And that's overarching feeling that I have for LGBT people, just generally speaking, when it comes to military service. We've continued to put our lives on the line and give our everything, ranging from our bodies to our minds, to our futures, to our ability to even reintegrate to a country that has often told us that we are not worthy, that we are not welcome, and that if we want to be here, we have to hide ourselves. And when you live in a community that's disenfranchised, that's marginalized, that's oppressed, that has very few options for getting out. I know for myself, I'm 3rd generation Navy. I got out because I didn't have any other options. Like my mom wasn't going to pay for college. My mom had gotten her college through the military. And so my options were limited. And the country, especially, in the last 20 years, as the emergence of trans identity has really started to grow, the country has not always been ready for this, has not always been ready for us. And it hasn't always been safe. And so the military, I don't know, I think for marginalized populations, there's something that draws people to the military because it's a family. When you've been kicked out of yours, when you have been rejected, when you are just looking for somewhere that you can belong, you're looking for a place like the military. And if you're looking to change your life circumstances, then the military is a great option for that. What they don't advertise on TV is what they do to us, and the psychological warfare. Honestly, the entire military service is inherently traumatic when you recognize that they tell you from the jump, we're going to break you down and build you back into what we want you to be. They never build you back into what you were before. And so I think it's important that no matter what identity we're talking about, that we understand that the military traumatizes us, it breaks us, and intentionally so. And we'll actually tell you that. And so for our identity formation, when it comes to how we reintegrate after that, those are the youngest, most youthful years that we gave away, that the moments when our identity is being formed, and it doesn't come back, if that makes sense. And so I think that all of those things are really important to understanding what sacrifices are made and how people hold that trauma.
Yeah, and I'm thinking too, Lindsay, and I've heard this sort of anecdotally, and I'm curious what you think about this, is that for trans people coming back into a trans community, the fact that they served in the military may not be accepted by their trans community because of all of the things that you talked about that the military represents.
Yeah, I think that's actually not just trans people, it's also LGBT folks. I used to sit on a council. It was the LGBTQ council for the city of Seattle. I was the only veteran, and I don't think any of them had ever really hung out with veterans. And at the end of it, I was like, I had been on it for 2 years, and we were doing this like, I can't remember what it was, but it was like props. And so somebody had said like, I'm really grateful that you were here, because before this, I like honestly just had a really poor impression of veterans because they equate us with the police. And so something that's always come up for me is that there's two options when you get out of the military for your identity, because don't ask, don't tell, the trans man policies that require that you hide yourself. When you go to put those back together after service, you're unqualified to do so because it's really hard to do. But two, like you have to pick one or the other. I know when I was getting out, I either had to pick being a veteran or being queer. And one side or the other, you're going to be marginalized. The veteran community is toxic as all get out for queer people, and was especially in 2012 when I got out, because policy had just been turned over, like it had just been changed. So the military veteran community was still just as toxic for LGBTQ folks. The LGBTQ community does not like us, or at least does not like military service, and equates military service to being police. And that's not who we are. Many people joined and served out of no other option, that served because it was the only way that they were going to get healthcare. It was the only way that they were going to get away from their abusive parents. It was the only way that they were going to find a footing. It was the only, like, there's a million reasons why people serve. All of them are valid, but not all of them are understood. And so I think it's really to the detriment of queer veterans that we don't have a place to belong after service. And that sense of belonging, when destroyed after service, because that happens for everybody, like you leave the gate and they leave you behind. And that's like universally true for veterans. But when you also don't have a community to enter into, like, where do you go? You see that suicide numbers for LGBTQ folks are really high, housing insecurity, financial insecurity, like all of these issues that we see as marquee issues in our community. LGBTQ folks are more than likely going to be disproportionately impacted by those systems, because you don't have somewhere to belong. You don't have a system that understands you. Your identity is incoherent. And so therefore the services can't be built for you, and your identity can't be understood by either your veteran community, veteran counterparts, or the civilian population that's supposed to be there to support you.
Yeah, so it sounds like what we're talking about is being lost and not belonging to either of these two communities that are both essential to who you are and what your experience has been, and sort of being stuck there without a place to go. And so sort of building on that a little bit, what we see in the data, it suggests pretty clearly that transgender, gender nonconforming veterans are more likely to experience unsheltered homelessness than their cisgendered peers. And what do you think some of the reasons are for that? We've talked a little bit about some of that being lost and not finding community, but what else do you think are some of the reasons for that?
I mean, in the housing space, I think a lot of it is safety. There's not the systems of of shelters are not built for people like me. I'm a non-binary person. Like I would go to a women's shelter, but not everybody has that option. People don't know what they're going to be treated like when they get there. People don't know if they're going to be, sometimes there's like policies that make you have to go with your sex assigned at birth, as opposed to your gender identity, which is not safe. Putting a trans woman in a men's shelter is, one, inhumane, but two, deeply unsafe, because of the incoherence that I talked about, like the incoherence of identity and the brutalization of identities. So I think part of it is safety. And I think that's one of the biggest things is, like, if I would be, as a veteran, I'm probably more equipped to fend off people in unsheltered homelessness than I am in a shelter. And so you pick where you're safest, right? You pick the place that you feel like you can defend yourself. I'm going to live in a vehicle. I'm going to live wherever I have to. But if I go to that shelter, I'm likely to be harmed. I'm likely to be, othered, treated poorly, or brutalized. The other part is equal access. There's like not all folks are covered by fair housing. Not all folks are able to get housing that's assigned, like I said, assigned with their gender identity as opposed to their sex assigned at birth. So outside of the safety concerns, it's also a validation of who you are. And so that's one of the biggest things that I see is like, there are no LGBTQ homeless shelters for veterans right now. That I can find, at least across the country, I can't find one. And that's a problem when you know that this generation of veteran is the most sexual and gender diverse in history. So what are we going to do to build a system that's actually able to catch those folks? Because right now, folks are more likely to turn to unsheltered homelessness, LGBT places that are LGBTQ specific, which don't exist in rural populations. They don't exist in outside of population hubs. Those systems that we build in places like Seattle are not accessible in a place like Spokane, Washington, or like a smaller community. And so people will turn where they have to be able to survive, because that's what we like, what we're just used to surviving. But the opportunity to thrive is not really there because these systems are not built for us. And oftentimes are built to keep us down. And so I think that's the biggest thing that I have is like safety concerns, and inability and incoherence.
Yeah. So you're saying the systems, they're not built for you. They're not there. There's this big void. What can we do to fix those past and current inequities in the system to help LGBTQ plus veterans have access to that safe and affordable housing that they need?
There's some big things and there's some little things. So something that seems little but is big is data collection. We don't collect data on sexual orientation and gender identity, whether it be at the VA. The VA does not capture this information. Department of Defense does not capture this information. Most housing associations or organizations, most nonprofits, do not capture this information. We, at this point, when I mentioned that we have 1 million LGBTQ veterans, that number is based off of a study, or there was a population estimate that was done in 1999. I wasn't even out then. I wasn't even a service member then. That number has been being used since 2000.
Wow.
We have no idea how big of a problem we have because we can't even look at the data. Because the data doesn't exist, we can't fix a problem if we can't see a problem. And so I think first and foremost, the most simple thing that we can do is advocate for better data collection. Our organizations themselves can collect better data, and we can petition the VA to do a better job of collecting this data, because honestly, nobody has any idea about the scope of the problem. Like when we do point in time counts, I can tell you that I can tell you how many trans non-binary veterans that they've found. That doesn't mean that they've captured everybody, that people know that they're have identified that they're veterans if they are. And then when you get down there, people will tell you that the number is too small for you to be able to use it. And I'm like, at some point, the data has to be there if we're ever going to fix this problem. The other is, like I pointed to, creating more transitional housing in populations that are LGBTQ. They can't just, they need to be veteran specific, because there are very specific traumas associated with being a veteran. There are very specific needs associated with being a veteran. Why do we not have more LGBTQ veteran transitional housing? Where does it exist? Where are we sending people to? Because right now, there's no safety net for LGBTQ veterans. They're either going to go to a veteran shelter and they're going to be othered, marginalized, and treated poorly, or they're going to go somewhere else and they're not going to understand their veteran identity, or they might not even be welcome. So that's number two. The number three is training and education. People need to be educated on the issues and challenges and the experiences of LGBTQ veterans. If you don't know what's going on, or you don't know the history of the very basic things, like everybody should understand that don't ask, don't tell. They should get a deeper understanding of don't ask, don't tell, how it impacted the community, how it shows up today in 2022, even though it's been gone for 10 years. What are the issues and challenges related to it? Same thing with the trans man. It's not that hard to educate yourself and continue to make sure that that's a part of your core curriculum when you're teaching people who are new employees. If you can treat people better at the door, they're more likely to come back to you, even if you don't have what they need at the time. They won't come back to you if you treat them poorly. They will not come back to you. If you cannot use they, them pronouns appropriately, I will never go back to you. And same thing with most people. If you're treated poorly and people do not even know how to ask you your gender identity, I'm done. I'm out. So training and education is your first line of defense to be able to keep these folks coming back to you, because attrition is real and you want people to retain. If you want people to retain, you have to help people understand how to treat them better. So training and education is something that every organization should be doing long before they ever have an LGBTQ program. If you have not educated your own organization about the unique needs of LGBTQ veterans, you do not have any business going out there and starting programs for LGBTQ veterans. You must make it a core training and a core requirement. And then the last one that I have for today, I have many, is looking at discharge upgrades. Discharge upgrades, legal services. If you are working on housing, you should also have connections to these types of organizations, because one, discharge upgrades for LGBTQ folks that served under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, folks that served under the trans ban that might have been removed under policies that were not necessarily related to being quote unquote the trans ban, but it was. Legal services for name changes, for because a lot of folks end up in housing, end up financially and housing insecure because of legal problems. And so making sure that we have these types of services available to LGBTQ veterans so that they can get these addressed, so that they can get out of the cycle of homelessness, because it's going to keep happening. It's going to keep being a problem until those discharges are upgraded, until those legal services are provided, until those name changes are done. Military records with name changes are atrocious. And so having those types of things in place is going to be something that helps a lot of folks. And so that I have more, but those are the 4 that I got for you today.
Those are all great, Lindsay. Thank you. So I'm curious, as we're, trying to make these changes and doing this, how do we make sure that the voices of LGBTQ plus veterans are not just taken into account, but are leading these conversations and are really part of, integrated into what these solutions are and how we fix these inequities?
Yeah. For organizations, I think it's 3, staff, board, and councils. Your staff should be reflective of the community. If you don't have an LGBTQ veteran on your staff and you have more than 10 people, you're not hitting the mark. LGBTQ folks, I think, are about 5% of the veteran population. Overrepresentation is a goal. So if at minimum, and you have 20 employees, one of those folks should be an LGBTQ veteran if you're working on employing veterans. Your staff should be reflective of the folks that you hope to serve. Otherwise, you're missing a mark. Your board should also have somebody on it that represents the LGBTQ veteran community. Your board leads your solution building. They hold people accountable. They are at the helm of leadership for any organization. You should have representation from the LGBTQ veteran community on your board. If you truly want to serve that community, you need to empower those folks as leaders. I also advise people to find a council. It feels a little bit like a checklist at some points when you're looking at inclusion. I know a lot of folks say that, like, I feel like I'm just doing a checklist. At the beginning, you are. One of those checklist items is do you have a council? Do you have a group of folks that are leading your solutions? Do you have people that you can talk to? Because you need folks that have lived experience or are able to help you unpack those challenges. And if you have a council, you're more likely to get more voices to create better solutions. You could get people across intersectional identities. You can bring in, folks from the trans community, folks from the LGBT community, folks who are racial and ethnic minorities, folks who identify as women, folks who identify as non-binary. You can pull together a really solid group of folks on a council that can then help you guide your solutions to a better outcome. If you don't have any of that, you should be doing feedback with every one of your clients and asking that information. I already told you data collection is really important. Take those surveys, those exit surveys. Once you have that sexual orientation and gender identity on your surveys, on your intakes, all of it, look at the feedback for those specific communities. When you do, most people do exit surveys, they do feedback. Parse it out by gender identity, parse it out by sexual orientation. I would venture to guess that if you've never looked at this and you're just getting started, you're going to find that those folks have been treated poorly, have lower feedback, and are less likely to come back to you. So starting to look at that feedback is another opportunity for you to learn. Feedback is like, people always just kind of build programs, or often to build programs to build them. But when somebody doesn't like them, they're like, well, you got it for free, so it doesn't really matter. That is no longer where we are. Communities have a voice, they have agency, and they have the internet. So if you want to be, for those folks to come back, then you're going to need to look at their feedback. You're going to look at what they said. How did they tell you that your services could be improved? Not just looking at that feedback, but incorporating that feedback into the work that you do. So if they said that so-and-so treated me poorly, you couldn't use they, them pronouns, close that feedback loop by reaching back out and saying, this is what we've done to address that problem. We have trained our entire staff on how to use the appropriate pronouns and how to treat people with dignity. Closing that loop gives people voice, agency, and helps them understand that you are actually listening. So if you don't have people to bring to the table, then look at your feedback, look at your data, look at that. What are people saying about the work that you're doing? Because that's the same voice that you're looking for if you don't have those identified leaders, if you don't have those communities that feel trusting of you to come in and help you with your work. So take a look at your feedback, make sure that you're representative in your leadership, make sure that your staff is representative, and make sure that they're trained.
Well, there's so much great stuff there. And I think one of the things that stood out to me is both from the council perspective, but also the feedback from your clients is that when you take that sort of approach, you are not expecting one person to be the voice of an entire community, right? You're not putting that pressure on, you are the person who we have to listen to. It is part of listening to a broader sampling of that community.
It strengthens your organization to do so. Honestly, like to incorporate better feedback strengthens your work. It brings more people to the table. You should be doing this across the identity spectrum. You shouldn't just be doing this for sexual orientation and gender identity, but for race, for religion, for socioeconomic status. People in poverty often treated even worse than anybody, especially in the housing space. Like looking at identities, and if you're asking that demographic information on your intakes, and you're not using it to look at your feedback at the same time, you're not using that data to the most. You're collecting that data more for you than you are for anybody else. And so I highly, highly encourage people to really take that feedback and not take it as a defensive. Like you can't be defensive about the feedback. You have to, all feedback is valuable and gives us an opportunity to learn and do better.
Well, I just want to say, Lindsay, if you have any other things you'd like to share before we close for today, it's been a great conversation. I feel like there's so much that we've learned today about what we can do better as a community, as a community that supports veterans of all kinds, to make sure that they all have that access to housing. Any last words you'd like to share with us?
I think the last thing, I said it before, is look to the margins. It'll help you understand your work better. When we do better by minority communities, we create better services for everybody. We talk a lot about bathrooms around here because I hate using them because I look as I do. Oftentimes I'm, treated poorly in the bathroom or stared at or harassed and so we joke a lot about bathrooms. Well, we don't really joke, but we talk about bathrooms a lot around here. And we brought up the example of like, everybody just wants to go to the bathroom in private and peace. But if we are looking at this from the lens of like trans people are like harassed, treated poorly, brutalized in the bathroom, and we create better solutions for trans people to use the bathrooms, guess who benefits? Every single person. Most people don't want this to happen anyways. Like they want to see the bathrooms look different. But if we build a better solutions based off of these margins, everybody gets a better experience. And so it's not pie. It's actually like the opposite. The more that we look to those margins, the more that we say, I want to serve this community better, it actually makes it better for everybody. So take pie off the table. Let's just eat it. And let's talk about how building these solutions will make a better system for all of us. So that's my ending piece is building better systems is not to the detriment of anybody. It's to the benefit of everybody.
That's a great ending statement. Lindsay, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. And we'll look forward to hearing more from you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lindsay, for your honesty and insight into the experience of LGBTQ+ veterans, and for identifying concrete steps we can take moving forward to address discrimination and marginalization. Our next interview will explore a project that focuses on providing safe, affordable, gender-affirming housing for LGBTQ plus elders so they can age with dignity and respect. Let's hear what Bryan has to say. So today, I'm pleased to have Bryan Ellicott from Sage USA's SAGEVets program on our podcast today. Bryan, would you take a minute to introduce yourself and tell us about Sage USA?
Sure. So my name is Bryan Ellicott. I am the program manager of the SAGEVets program, which is actually a New York State program under the Sage umbrella. Sage has been around for 40 plus years, working tirelessly on behalf of LGBT older people, building off the momentum of Stonewall Uprising and emerging from the LGBT civil rights movement. A group of activists came together to ensure that LGBTQ older adults would age with respect and dignity. Sage formed a network of support for LGBT elders. This is still going on every day, and every day we are doing more and more to help all kinds of LGBTQ elders across the country.
Great. And you said that you're part of SAGEVets. Can you tell me a little bit more about what SAGEVets does?
Yeah, so SAGEVets is a statewide program that is funded through our state government and some other grants. But we do a lot of work around case management, support groups, social events, and then doing a lot of work specifically around discharge status upgrades and then survivor benefits now that they've been amended. Just helping our veterans navigate sort of that red tape and bureaucracy around the services that they're rightfully entitled to.
Great. That's really important work. I know you said that Sage USA, the large organization, was founded in response to Stonewall. Can you tell me a little bit about why Sage focuses on older LGBTQ plus adults, and what are some of the barriers or challenges that they face specifically when it comes to housing?
So specifically, LGBT elders are more likely to be isolated or alone or not have those next of kin supports due to being older and not having that accessibility to either children or other family members they've been estranged from. So historically, this is a very vulnerable population that could actually get into a lot of situations where they don't have someone to advocate for them or assist them or even sometimes take care of them towards the end of their lives.
So because of some of the inequities and discrimination and things that happened when they were younger, they don't have the same support network that perhaps a non-LGBTQ plus elder adult would have.
Exactly.
Great. So for this discussion, we're going to focus a little bit more on the development of Stonewall House. Can you just tell me a little bit about the project, kind of an overview of what Stonewall House is and who it serves?
Yeah, so this project specifically came up out of a needs assessment survey from 2014 where our clientele, our participants, voiced a concern around not having adequate housing that was safe and affirming to them at this phase of their lives. So Sage is historically not a direct housing provider. However, like I said, there was this assessment that went out where a need was voiced, and the management at Sage took this under consideration and started to put in the RFP process with NYCHO, which is the New York City Housing Authority, to see what options were out there, to see where we could grow and where we could fit best in this situation.
So it sounds like Sage saw a need for the population it was trying to serve and said, this might not be what we've historically done, but there's a need here and we need to find a way to fill it.
Exactly.
Great. And so what exactly is Stonewall House?
So Stonewall House is a New York City housing building that is still under NYCHA's control, but it is a place for LGBT affirming housing. It's not just for LGBT people. Under New York City fair housing laws, it just has to, the people who apply to live there have to be, they don't have to be LGBT. They just have to be more, let's say, aware of the LGBT community and okay with living amongst LGBT people.
So it's not exclusively for that population, but it's designed to be a place where they are welcomed and safe and feel like they can age in a comfortable setting.
Yes.
So
And they
how
also
did
have access to like case management and support services and programs downstairs. So it's kind of like a well-rounded independent living, but you're still around people in case you need that extra support at any given time.
so independent living with a kind of a nod to potentially being able to age in that community in place with other support services available.
The main priority is to age in place with dignity and respect so that you can, fulfill the rest of your life the way you want to.
That's great. So how did you mentioned the New York City being involved, but what kind of funding was used to develop this project, and what challenges did Sage face as you were trying to get this project underway?
So the funding came through the local city government and state government. Um, but the biggest challenges was getting the community buy-in and getting the community to understand why we needed this. Basically, the location of it is in Fort Greene, Brooklyn. So traditionally it is a low income BIPOC community. So we wanted all people to feel they had a sense of buy-in and awareness of who was coming into their community, right? And then there's also, making sure that those folks were eligible to come in. There was some, they utilized the 9% low income housing tax credit in the development. They used some project-based Section 8 housing choice vouchers as well. So the building already existed. It was already just making it more accommodable to older populations.
Okay, so it wasn't building it from scratch, it was retrofitting it to fit the population.
Exactly.
And what kind of, I know you mentioned that sort of getting the community buy-in was important, and that it was a low-income BIPOC community where Stonewall House is located. What kind of concerns did the community members bring about Stonewall House coming to be?
Just the usual concerns. They just wanted to know like who was coming, would they fit into the community well, would they stick out in the community? So just making sure that the community that was coming fit the demographic of the population that already lived there,
So that it was representative and the folks who were living there could have access to that housing as well.
Exactly.
So as Stonewall House was being, developed, what were some of the most important considerations, and were the folks that you were hoping would live there included in the process of figuring out what Stonewall House would be?
Yeah, so our housing team as well as our programs team did a lot of direct community outreach and info sessions and conversations to make sure that was represented the best way possible.
Great. So really making sure that the folks with the experience and who you were hoping would be able to move in were part of figuring out what it would look like. That's great. So once Stonewall was finished and it was developed, what did Sage do to make sure that the target population knew about Stonewall House and was able to apply? You couldn't just say, oh, Stonewall House is only for LGBT elders. So how did you make sure that those folks knew about it and were able to apply and be part of the community?
So that was just making sure that we were reaching out to those who were eligible and making sure that they knew, the deadlines and when the lottery opened, and making sure that our case managers were available to assist with that application process.
Great. So a lot of targeted outreach and assistance in the process.
Exactly.
And how would you say, I know you mentioned that there was concern from the community about whether it would fit in. How would you say that Stonewall House has fit into the community in Brooklyn and the BIPOC members and the folks that have lived there for a long time? How does it fit in?
I feel like they fitting in well. I haven't heard anything negative. I've only been at Sage though for 3 months, but I feel like it sounds like everything's going really well and the community is happy and our participants and community members that live there are happy. So It sounds like it's been going well.
And how long has it been up and running, Bryan?
Since 2014 it started, and I believe they opened, I don't have that off the top of my head. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. We can cut that part out. That's good.
Okay.
So in this process, figuring out the need to creating the property, to working with the local community, to getting folks in, what were some of the lessons that SAGE learned about affordable housing access and ongoing support that can be learned from this? And when I'm thinking about this, Bryan, I'm thinking sort of lessons for other providers or developers who are focused on LGBTQ plus veterans, that specific population, but also those who might be focusing on elderly veterans. So what are some of the lessons from this project that we could take away?
I think it's just the outreach part, making sure you're outreaching to the people who you want to live in these developments, because oftentimes with fair housing laws, you have to make sure that what you're creating, you make sure they sign up and get into it. The financing gaps that I've mentioned of making sure, unexpected things come up with, capital and services, grants, developer fees, those sorts of things. And then just getting the community buy-in. That's the biggest lesson learned, is just like community buy-in and the community understanding the displacement history of veterans and LGBT people, or both at the same time, and understanding that everyone should have a safe place to live, regardless of who they are, who they love, or any other things are just, not fair to everyone else. So making sure that people understand that like everyone has the right to a roof over their head is important.
Yeah, that idea that housing is a right, it's not something that you have to earn, that you should have a safe place to stay, regardless of who you are.
Right.
So is there anything else, Bryan, that you'd like to share about Stonewall House specifically, or SAGEVets work that you think could be helpful around how to serve this population better?
I think the biggest part, besides talking about the housing, is talking about the case management piece, and making sure that not only when we're, providing our veterans or our LGBT people or both, that, we're going to be providing them their own safe space, but also that it needs to come with full wraparound services like in-house case management, groups and social events, so that they can also start reintroducing themselves into their new community and into their environment, even if it's just going downstairs from their apartment to like the rec area, is starting that process of re-engaging into society in a new way.
So it sounds like what you're saying is, yes, everybody needs housing and they need safe, affordable housing, but they also need those wraparound services to meet the other needs that they may have, especially if you're talking about populations, whether it's veterans or LGBT folks or older adults who may have other complicating issues. That wraparound services piece is really key. Thank you, Lindsay and Bryan, for the great conversation. Before we end, I'd like to highlight a few key takeaways. First, the impacts of discriminatory policies like Don't Ask, Don't Tell and the trans ban are multifaceted, from discharge statuses that prevent veterans from accessing health care, the GI Bill, and other benefits, to trauma, psychological damage, and loss of identity. The current systems were not set up to serve LGBTQ plus veterans and contribute to the disproportionately high rates of suicide, housing insecurity, and financial insecurity in this population. Second, because of discrimination and systemic inequities, older LGBTQ plus individuals, including veterans, are more likely to be isolated and without a family network, leaving them vulnerable and in need of an advocate. Third, the voice of LGBTQ plus veterans must be integrated into all levels of the work, from staff to board to client, and lead the conversation moving forward. Finally, Everyone should have a safe place to live, regardless of who they are or who they love. You can learn more about the topics we discussed in this episode by checking out the weekly one-pager, which will include links to Minority Veterans of America, SAGE, and Stonewall House.